Okay, so thank you very much for this wonderful invitation to talk to you this afternoon, and thank you for the kind introduction, Sorrel. So the first thing to say, I have no conflicts of interest, but today I've been asked to talk to you really about the landscape of clinical trials in bone tumors. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about trials in osteochondroma and Ewings sarcoma, but also Catherine asked me to talk a little bit about what the influence of our patient advocacy has been on within our Ewings Consortium, and then also perhaps a little bit about what patients want to know or should ask about clinical trials. So I'm going to go through all of those and try not to take up too much time. So I'm going to start with osteosarcoma, and I think the first thing to say is there's not very much to say about osteosarcoma, and I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face. As you know, osteosarcoma is the most common primary bone tumor in young people. Patients have complex treatment really that involves really intense and quite debilitating chemotherapy and surgery that is needed really for cure. Around 2000, a clinical trial was set up involving many countries looking to see whether changing chemotherapy on the basis of response to initial treatment improved outcome. The reason I'm telling you about this today is because it demonstrated that it is possible to have a global collaboration. There were more than 2,000 patients involved in this trial from 17 countries, recruited in 6 years, but it closed in 2011, so that was about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, it didn't show that changing chemotherapy based on response made any difference to outcome. So the current standard of care is a chemotherapy called MAP, and there are no international consortia or clinical trials been set up since then. And in part that's because we're unclear of what the best next step was, and no new agents. But what happens when osteosarcoma comes back? Well, unfortunately, prognosis is generally quite poor, and patients do receive some chemotherapy. There have been quite a lot of clinical trials in this space, most of which have been negative, so have not been shown to be helpful treatment until probably about 4 years ago, when a whole host of clinical trials investigating tyrosine kinase inhibitors started being published. So these are drugs that target lots of different kinases that may be important in growth of lots of cancers. And I put this table up not to go to any of the details of them, but just to show there have been quite a few of these trials now, all showing similar effects that these drugs can help patients with osteosarcoma, but generally for about 4 months or so. So this is really interesting and of some benefit, but it's not long enough to make a big difference or cure patients with osteosarcoma. So what's happened subsequently is the question's been asked about, can you combine these agents with chemotherapy that patients give? And Nathalie Gaspar led a trial, phase 1, first of all, looking to see whether you could tolerate it, and found that it could be tolerated if you combine it with ifosfamide etoposide. And now there's a randomized phase 2 international study running, asking the question about whether adding the TKI is better than giving the chemotherapy on its own. It's open in many centers across the world. So actually this is a good example of a collaborative trial that's in fact been run by a pharmaceutical company. So it's a sponsored study. It's a good design. Not everybody gets the drug to start with because it's placebo controlled, or it's not placebo controlled, but one group doesn't get it, the drug. But if you do progress, you can cross over to the treatment. So I suppose everybody gets a chance to have the drug in some shape. One of the challenges of it that it stops at the age of 25. So you will have heard there's many discussions about pediatrics and young people not being able to access new agents. So the table is turned because in fact it started as a pediatric study. So if you're over the age of 25, you can't enter into the trial. And in fact, there are no studies for older patients. And there are also no studies for patients with newly diagnosed osteosarcoma, and little change over the last 10 years. So I think this is a very great unmet need for osteosarcoma, and we need an international consortium really to work collaboratively. And this is something that's now been discussed amongst many of us And there's going to be a discussion at CEOP Europe next week about how can we collaborate better and get going some osteosarcoma trials for bigger groups of patients. So watch this space. I'm then going to just briefly talk about chordoma. I'm not going to tell you about trials that are going on across the world and other series or small experiences of new agents, because I don't think that's the purpose of this. But I'm going to mention the trial in chordoma that we've been involved with, really to illustrate some other points. So chordomas, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are rare primary bone tumors arising in the spine, generally in the sacrum, which is the bottom of the spine, like this big lump here at the bottom, or in the base of the skull, so at the top of the spine. The main treatment is surgery with or without radiotherapy, and it can be proton beam radiotherapy. But the treatment can be really quite mutilating, and a lot of patients' disease comes back. There are no licensed drugs for this indication and no standard of care, and very few clinical trials. But this is a trial that's ongoing, an international trial that's going, that was set up by Hans Gelderblom, really looking at the role of an EGFR inhibitor in chordoma. That's on the basis of some good preclinical data collected by Adrian Flanagan in my institution, but also a group in Italy showing that these may have an important role. And so this was set up as an investigator-initiated study. So it's an academic study that's been funded by the Chordoma Foundation and with some input from Chordoma UK and some input from Boehringer Ingelheim, who make the drug, to run this trial. Because it was an academic trial, it took a long time to open because there's quite a lot of things that had to be sorted out. But essentially, the aim of it is to see how well it works in this group of patients, but also to understand what effects it has on quality of life and pain, because you know, patients with chordoma really do live with very debilitating side effects. So it's looking at two things on the one side, but then also what side effects do patients get, and how does that may impact their quality of life as well. It's for patients who've had drugs before for chordoma or haven't. And it opened about 3 years ago in Leiden, 2 years ago in London, and about a year ago in Milan. So these are the 3 centers that are open. It had an interim assessment after 20 patients, which essentially showed that there's sufficient activity to continue the trial. And so we are currently recruiting patients. We aim to get up to 40 altogether to really understand whether this treatment is helpful. So I think this is important because it's the first international clinical trial of chordoma with a drug ever. And it's recruiting very well. In my institution, I think we've recruited 12 patients, and I'm getting inquiries across the country. It is challenging though, because there are not lots of sites, and so patients have to travel. It's a tablet, so at least that makes it a bit more manageable. We've also been able to, with COVID, set up more remote visits to allow patients not to have to come all the time. So I think it's important for those reasons, but we don't know if it helps or not, but we will wait and see. So now I'm going to move on to Ewing sarcoma, and I'll spend the rest of the time really talking about Ewings and then some of the patient advocacy. Most of you know Ewings is also a bone tumor seen in teenagers. It also involves complex chemotherapy and local control for treatment. But I think what's different with osteosarcoma is the evolution of this treatment has really been through collaborative international clinical trials. And so there's a history of that. And then in November 2013, we got funding to continue this collaboration, or really build on it and really capitalize and improve on the work that had been done before. This is the Ewings Consortium that was based on nearly £6 million of funding from a European grant. And it was to run 2 clinical trials, which I'll talk about, Ewings 2012 and Recur. But it also allowed us to do a whole lot of translational research, biobanking, and look at some biomarkers of response. And this involved 21 partners from 9 countries. So really trying to open up and get the best treatment to patients across Europe. But importantly, as part of this is also a dissemination and patient and public involvement work package. This funded meetings twice a year in person. So we've had 13 meetings altogether, and it has allowed us to set up and develop a multinational patient advocacy group that are fully integrated in all activities. And I think completely underpinned all the success of the consortium. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But let's just talk about the trials, and not too much in the detail, but just to give you an essence of what we've been trying to do. So Ewings 2012 was looking at 2 different chemotherapy regimens in patients with newly diagnosed treatment. This is the protocol. It looks very confusing and quite complicated. Essentially, what I would say to patients, it's randomizing you between the treatment that is standard of treatment in America versus what was standard treatment in Europe. And we wanted to see, because both of these had reasonable results, essentially which is the best one to be standard treatment, and make sure that people are getting the best treatment they can. There's also another randomization with a drug called zoledronic acid, which hasn't been reported as yet. But what we were able to demonstrate that with collaboration, we could recruit patients quickly, about 5 years to recruit 640 patients. And the trial showed that the VDC-IE chemotherapy had better survival in terms of event-free and overall survival. And so we now know across the world that this is the best standard of treatment for patients, and that's what they should receive. So I'll come on to what happens next with that, but I'll just mention now what happens in relapsed Ewing sarcoma. So we know again that patients whose disease comes back unfortunately have a poor prognosis. We know also there are lots of chemotherapies being used by different people, but there's no prospective evidence about which is the best one to give, and none of them are standard of care. So Recur also set out to ask a relatively simple question: is what is the best treatment to give patients who have Ewing sarcoma when it comes back? And so this study, it's something called a multi-arm, multi-stage design, that you can drop arms and add arms according to what's available. We started with the 4 standard treatments in those little boxes on the left. Don't worry about the details so much, but essentially, again, what we were able to demonstrate with using a collaborative approach, that we can recruit patients, and within a couple of years, we were able to show that the gemcitabine and docetaxel was less effective than the others. It doesn't mean it doesn't work at all, but it was less effective than the others, and we dropped an arm of that. That was presented a couple of years ago now. And then last year, continuing recruitment, at that time, about 360 patients showed that irinotecan and temozolomide wasn't quite as effective as the other 2 drugs. And so that study has been ongoing. There's some more adjustments going to be announced fairly soon about treatment. But what this protocol also does is allow us to add new chemotherapy and new novel agents to the protocol, so that patients can have access to new drugs. But if you're going to add a new drug, you have to say, well, what is the new drug? And I know for people who've been in many of our consortium meetings, there's a lot of frustration about where are those new drugs? Why are we not putting them into Recur? And of course, you can't put them into Recur until you know that there's some benefit from them. You also want to know that can they be combined with chemotherapy to have the best effect. So what are those new targets? So this, I won't go into the science a lot, but there was a group of drugs called PARP inhibitors that looked very promising in the preclinical models. There are a number of trials run in that space. I ran one of them, but unfortunately, although the science was very good, the minute you combine them with chemotherapy, they were too toxic to give high enough doses to be better than chemotherapy. The next group of drugs, similar to osteosarcoma, the TKIs, which I'll come back to. And then the third is a novel drug developed by Jeff Turetsky that really targets that fusion protein in Ewing sarcoma. So this is probably one of the most exciting things to happen in Ewing sarcoma in the last 10 years. It's not quite ready to develop further yet. There has been a phase 1/2 study with a few patients receiving the drug in phase 2, and 2 of them having a complete response, which is extraordinary and super, super exciting. But many other patients didn't benefit from it, or didn't have stable disease that lasted very long. So there's been a very big lot of excitement in our community about why have we not got that drug? Why is it not going into clinical trials? It's just not ready yet. We don't know why some patients benefit and some don't. And so there are more studies that need to be done before we can pull that into into treatments. But certainly that's something that everybody's super interested in, and we are have had a very collaborative approach with Oncternal, which is the biotech company that makes it, and our colleagues in America. So we have got the infrastructure to bring this across when we think it's ready, but it's not quite ready yet to come forward into our clinical trials. But the other drugs that are ready are the TKIs. Again, similar to osteosarcoma, some patients benefit, but more or less for about 3 or 4 months. So this isn't going to cure people, but we think how you can make have this benefit patients is if you combine them with chemotherapy, you get like osteosarcoma. And so that's what the new Ewings clinical trial is using VDCIE as our backbone. And then we've got some other questions. So can we add a new agent to treatment? Could maintenance help patients? And could some alteration to radiotherapy help patients? And this is under a funding review at the moment. But what we've able to do with Ewings is extend our collaboration outside the EU for the first time, so beyond the EEC. But we've worked really collaboratively within the EEC to develop this protocol and have been very inclusive, all of our patient advocates, to do so. So I'm going to come on to the patient advocacy side now, just to tell you a little bit about why and how patient advocacy has been so instrumental in the success of the Ewings. I think the first thing I was reflecting on talking about this, so why has it been successful? I think the initial grant gave us the opportunity to form a group of patient advocates that has grown as time has gone by in number and expertise and confidence to really be part of the group and work together with us. We were able to have face-to-face meetings twice a year. So this is one of the pictures from the meetings, and become friends and really work together as a group. And I suppose part of the reason for me to put up this picture is we haven't been able to do this recently for the last couple of years. Many meetings such as this can work well, but if you to establish new relationships and really work together, there's nothing like a face-to-face meeting. There's nothing like going out for dinner and all being part of an opportunity to spend days together, sitting around tables, have the microphone handed to you and just talk amongst your friends. And really, I think that's probably been one of the biggest things that's happened. We've had lots of opportunities where patient advocates actually influence the protocols. For example, even back at the beginning of the Recur protocol, we had a discussion about having bone marrows mandated, and because of what patient advocates said that, you know, this is an invasive procedure, we don't think that should be applicable, that was taken out of the protocol. The patients have, patient advocates have been involved in all our patient information. They've been very involved in the dissemination, communication about the trials. But also we gave an opportunity for patient advocates to be part of our steering committee and trial management groups, right from the beginning, integrating into decision-making about design and amendments. And that experience has evolved so that patient advocates have input into the design of our next trials. And also just having this voice every meeting to say how we should define our priorities. And these are the ones that have come up at the bottom. Really, where are the new drugs? Where are the new drugs? We must all work together to get them and look at quality of life and impact of the treatments at every time. Also make us accountable for extra visits and sample collection and making sure that we use the samples that are collected to do the translational research that we set out to do. There have been lots of other great contributions. Andy did a survey on social media about what we should prioritize. In the interest of time, I can't really go through it, but it's really fed back into what we should be doing. We've been able to link and collaborate with other projects and resources. Chris Copeland, who I'm sure many of you know, has been involved in the Accelerate program and the FAIR, access to new drugs for teenagers. We've linked with Peter Pan that provided funding to support young researchers. Ornella's been fantastic in also getting us some support for researchers. And we've been now to start making links with some US groups. And since the original funding of Ewings Consortium ended in 2019, certainly there was the will and appetite to continue the consortium despite the funding. So we're very grateful to the Ewing Sarcoma Research Trust, who fund Abby Evans, who many of you may know, who remains our project scientific manager, And we've set up an executive committee with 3 patient advocates. So there's 10 committee members reflecting geography and expertise across Europe, and 3 patient advocates who, again, really hold us to account. And when we talked about this, I think this probably, what is the major impact of patient advocates, and this is from Abby and come from the patient advocates, the fact that patients are here and on committee mean that we're always answerable, we have to be transparent in what we're doing and have an increased drive to improve the situation, putting patients at the center of everything and pushing us to do better and faster. And I mean, definitely in the meetings is, why are things not working faster? Why are you not doing more? And I think it's so powerful to have the patient voice at all our meetings. So I'm just gonna, I'm sorry I'm running over a little bit, but I'm just gonna talk a couple of slides about clinical trials about patients. This is not only to do with bone sarcomas, but I was asked to say, you know, what should patients know and ask about clinical trials during their journey? So just a few thoughts of reflection. In fact, I asked the patient advocates their thoughts. So some of this is reflecting my thoughts and some of it's reflecting what we got back from our advocates. I think the first thing is patients should always ask, are there any clinical trials? And how can I find out about trials? I think this is a massive issue for patients. They don't know what might be going on. Are there any reliable online resources and are they up to date? So I'm making a little plug for Sarcoma UK, who in fact, in response to patients, set up a clinical trials hub that tells you about some of the trials that are in, but they're in the UK and they're for UK patients. And you know, they may be limited. So I think having some resources is great, but patients should always ask the clinician. And again, we need to be accountable to knowing and being able to discuss any clinical trials. So when we asked our patient advocates, what do you think patients should know and ask? Of course, it depends on where you are in the journey. Is this curative treatment? Is it first-line treatment? Is it palliative? But really the principles are the same. When discussing a clinical trial, you know, you need to ask why you're being on it. I think the first 2 are the biggest thing is, you know, will partaking on this give me access to better treatments or new agents, or will I be at more risk? And will there be more side effects? And of course, there's that risk-benefit balance that we talk about in oncology all the time. And I think it really comes down to a lot of that. There's some lots of practical considerations. And will I have information? Will I be able to understand what's going on? Will I have somebody to talk to ask questions? And will I be, I think this is very interesting, is will you tell me what's happening to the trial as it goes along? And this can be challenging when the results haven't been presented, but after the trial, will I be told the results? And it really made me reflect that I don't think we're good enough at telling patients the results of the trials that they go on. And you know, it's something that I think I'll take back and really think about some more, because even the Ewings 2012 results, have we told everybody about those results? I'm not sure that we have. But the final thing I wanted to talk about was about later in the journey. So when patients are not going to be cured or have run out of standard options, how do we have a discussion about trials then? Because patients always want to know, is there another treatment? Is there something new to give hope? And so I'm very cognizant in my consultations with patients, they will often say, well, what's next if this doesn't work? And so always you have to say, if there's a trial or if there isn't a trial, and be thinking about referring at the right time or doing the right tests or biopsies to confirm eligibility. But I've put this as a final reflection, and not to be depressing and at the end, but I thought this was really powerful reflection with a patient advocate that we've been involved with in another a grand challenge application, actually. You want to know that there's good science behind a trial. You want to know what the chance of it helping me is. So you absolutely want the hope and you want the new drugs. But this mum said, if I know my child or I have limited time, I don't want to waste it on something that isn't going to work. So I think we have to be very balanced and open and honest with patients about whether we think trials are going to work or not. People are very interested in new agents, but sometimes the treatment that we have available can be better than a clinical trial. And so I think it's that relationship and the continuity of care with patients that can allow you to have that open conversation, but absolutely always ask the question about clinical trials and hold oncologists accountable to knowing about them and getting the information if they don't have it to hand. So I'm going to finish there. I just really want to thank all our patient advocates and Abby Evans, who essentially runs the Ewings Consortium and any of this, most of this sort of work, and also all the charities and people involved who want to fund the difficulty that is sarcoma. And again, the Ewing Sarcoma Research Trust for funding the EEC. So thank you very much.